Stephen Furtick. Shocked, Ibrahim Traoré's words redefine Christianity forever. One such moment unfolded in South Africa, where faith and power collided before the eyes of the world. On one side stood Stephen Furtick, a preacher who had filled stadiums and built one of the most influential ministries of the modern age. On the other stood Ibrahim Traoré, the fiery young leader of Burkina Faso, a man who had defied empires and spoken with the authority of a prophet. The clash was not about politics alone. It was about the very soul of Christianity in Africa. Would it remain chained to colonial legacies, or would it rise again as a gospel of liberation, a faith that restores dignity and demands justice? The hall was thick with anticipation as cameras rolled, pastors leaned forward, and the world waited for the first words. This was not a debate, it was destiny unfolding. Stay with us. This story is more than a debate. It is a battle for the soul of Africa. Subscribe now and let us walk this journey together. The sun was setting over Johannesburg when the Global Faith Leadership Forum opened its doors. Inside the grand auditorium, chandeliers glistened overhead and rows upon rows of leaders from every continent filled the seats. Pastors in clerical collars sat beside politicians in dark suits. Bishops in flowing robes shared the stage with professors and activists. This was not an ordinary conference. It was a rare gathering where religion and politics met openly, a place where the language of faith collided with the raw demands of power. Among the invited names, two figures drew more attention than any others. Stephen Furtick, the American pastor known for his powerful preaching and rock concert-style worship services, had traveled across oceans to join the forum. His ministry had become a global brand, streamed into living rooms and smartphones, shaping the faith of millions who saw in him a fresh and modern voice of Christianity. His presence was expected, almost predictable. But Ibrahim Traoré, the young military leader of Burkina Faso, was a surprise. At only his mid-30s, he had already shaken the political order of West Africa by standing against French dominance and calling for African sovereignty. His rise was meteoric, his speeches electrifying, and his words carried the unusual weight of both soldier and prophet. Many asked, why would a soldier from Ouagadougou be given the pulpit at a faith forum? Yet those who had followed his rise knew he carried something more than politics. He spoke with a conviction that stirred hearts, a tone that blurred the line between sermon and battle cry. As the first sessions passed, discussions turned on unity, leadership, and the future of faith communities in a fractured world. Cameras from BBC, Al Jazeera, CNN, and countless African broadcasters captured every moment. But the atmosphere shifted when Furtick, never one to shy away from what he considered theological error, decided to confront Traoré. It happened during a break after a panel session. The audience lingered, buzzing with curiosity, sensing that something unusual was about to unfold. Furtick walked steadily across the stage, Bible in hand, his expression composed but firm. Traoré, in his dark military uniform, remained seated, calm and watchful. The moment their eyes locked, the room grew tense. People leaned forward, journalists raised their cameras, and the hall quieted to a nervous stillness. Furtick's voice rang clear, amplified by microphones still live. Mr. Traoré, I respect your passion for your people and your commitment to justice. But let me ask you plainly, where do you stand with Jesus Christ? Because justice and morality are not enough without acknowledging him as Lord and Savior. He is the way, the truth, and the life. Gasps rippled through the hall. The challenge was direct, unmistakable. It was no longer about politics or economics. It was about salvation itself, about the heart of faith. Every eye turned to the young president from Burkina Faso. Traoré did not flinch. He sat in silence for a moment, his steady gaze fixed on Furtick, as though he had long anticipated this very question. When he spoke, his voice was measured, almost gentle. Pastor, he said, I appreciate your boldness. I understand you speak as a shepherd concerned for souls. But allow me to ask you, what does it mean to acknowledge Christ? The audience shifted in their seats. Furtick raised his Bible and responded swiftly, quoting Romans, "It means confessing with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believing in your heart that God raised him from the dead. Without that, all else is empty. Good works, leadership, even justice will fade away. Nods of agreement rose among many American pastors in the crowd. But others watched Traoré with curiosity, waiting for his reply. The young leader leaned forward, his tone carrying a quiet intensity. In Africa, we know Jesus. We know him not only in the sermons of great churches, but in the prayers of our grandmothers beneath the trees when they had nothing else to offer. We know him in the farmers who bow over their harvest and whisper, "Thank you, Lord," before they touch the first fruit. We know him in the mothers who, when hospitals turned them away, cried out in his name and saw their children healed. Do not think that Africans do not know Christ. We may not have stadiums or sound systems, but we have witnessed his power. The hall stirred. Some clapped softly, others whispered. Cameras zoomed in closer. Then his tone sharpened. But here is my challenge to you, Pastor. You say confession is about words. But what is confession if not lived out? Is it raising your hands on Sunday but exploiting workers on Monday? Is it singing to Jesus in worship while ignoring injustice when it costs you something? Words are easy. True confession is faithfulness when no one is watching, sacrifice when there is no applause. That pastor is the Christ we know. The words landed like thunder. The crowd broke into murmurs, some cheering, others uneasy. Furtick's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, caught in the weight of the response. The atmosphere had shifted. What began as a theological question was turning into something larger. The room no longer felt like an academic conference. It felt like a courtroom of history, with Africa itself on the witness stand. And all waited for what would come next. The silence that followed was heavy, almost unbearable. Every heartbeat seemed to echo through the vast hall. Stephen Furtick, gripping his Bible tightly, leaned closer to the microphone. His voice, steady but tinged with urgency, broke through the hush. Mr. President, salvation is not found in works. It is not in justice, not in feeding the poor, not in standing against oppression. Salvation is by grace alone, through Christ alone. If we lean on human effort, we fall. Grace is the only anchor. Many in the audience nodded, familiar with these words from their own pulpits. It was the doctrine that had shaped evangelical Christianity for centuries. Cameras panned across the crowd, capturing the divided expressions, some affirming, some unsettled. But Traoré's eyes did not waver. He inhaled deeply, then spoke with a rising intensity that rolled across the auditorium like a gathering storm. Grace is real, Pastor. Without it, none of us could stand. But tell me, what is grace if not power to live differently? Grace that does not transform lives, that does not compel justice, that does not heal broken societies, is that grace at all? Or is it merely comfort dressed as faith? His words struck deep. The hall erupted in murmurs, gasps, and a scattering of applause. Some pastors shook their heads, others clapped their hands as if chains had been broken. Traoré rose slowly to his feet. The moment he stood, the atmosphere shifted completely. His tall frame, clad in the dark uniform of a soldier, seemed to grow larger with every word. He was no longer a guest on stage. He was a herald, a prophet, a voice crying out from the soil of Africa. Too long, he thundered. Christianity was used in Africa not as liberation but as chains. My people were told to close their eyes in prayer, and when they opened them, their land, their gold, their very freedom was gone. We were given a Christ of colonizers, a Christ who blessed the oppressor while silencing the oppressed. But the Christ I know is different. He overturned the tables of the money changers. He told the rich young man to give up his wealth for the poor. He came to set the captives free. That is the Christ who walks with us. The crowd stirred like a sea in storm. Some leapt to their feet, clapping furiously. Others sat rigid, their faces pale with discomfort. Furtick raised his hand, trying to interject, but Traoré pressed on, his voice rising, each phrase like a hammer blow. Do not bring us a gospel that excuses oppression. Do not bring us a gospel that tells the slave to obey while the master steals his labor. Do not bring us a gospel that blesses nations that plunder Africa while calling Africans lazy. That gospel is not the gospel of Christ. It is the gospel of empire. The hall erupted. Applause thundered. Shouts rose from the crowd, and journalists scrambled to capture every second. The sound was deafening. Furtick's face tightened. He raised his microphone, almost whispering against the roar. But if you preach justice without faith, Mr. President, do you not risk making Christianity just another political movement? The Bible says Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through him. The applause quieted, the hall bracing for Traoré's answer. He lowered his voice, but every syllable carried a blade of truth. I do not dispute the words of Christ, but what does it mean to walk in his way? Is it memorizing verses while ignoring injustice? Is it singing of heaven while leaving children hungry on earth? Is it building megachurches in the West while villages in Africa have no clean water? If Christianity is only words without compassion, then it is not Christ's way. It is theater. It is business. Gasps filled the hall. Some pastors covered their mouths, others nodded with tears in their eyes. Traoré stepped forward, his hand raised, his voice breaking through centuries of silence. Hear me well. The Christ of colonizers is dead to us. The Christ of liberation lives, and if you preach him, if you preach a Christ who restores dignity, who lifts the oppressed, who stands with Africa, then I will stand with you, Pastor. But if Christ is used as chains, then I will resist him with every fiber of my being. Because the Christ I know does not enslave, he sets free. The roar that followed was unlike anything the hall had witnessed. People shouted, clapped, some even wept openly. Reporters wrote furiously, commentators whispered, and cameras zoomed in on Furtick's face, searching for signs of defeat. But Furtick was not defeated. He was humbled. His eyes glistened, as if he had glimpsed a truth he had long preached but never fully lived. He tightened his grip on the Bible, leaned forward, and said softly, "Perhaps, Mr. President, we are closer in spirit than I realized." The crowd quieted, sensing a shift. The confrontation had become more than a clash of theology. It was the birth of a new conversation, one that would ripple far beyond those walls. Long after the lights dimmed in Johannesburg and the applause faded into memory, the echoes of that confrontation spread like wildfire across Africa. Clips of Ibrahim Traoré's words traveled from television broadcasts to WhatsApp groups, from local radio stations to diaspora churches in Atlanta, London, and Paris. Elders in rural villages repeated his lines as though they were proverbs. Students on university campuses debated them late into the night. Something had shifted. In Burkina Faso itself, the response was immediate. For years, churches had wrestled with a tension between inherited Western traditions and the raw, lived faith of ordinary people. Some saw Christianity as a foreign cloak, ill-fitting on African shoulders. Others clung to it as the heart of their hope. But after Traoré's exchange with Furtick, that debate took on a new clarity. Suddenly people were asking, what if Christ is not the property of Europe or America? What if he belongs to Africa too, fully and without apology? Markets buzzed with conversations not just about politics, but about sermons. Pastors who once avoided politics now preached boldly about justice. Youth groups in Ouagadougou began to chant lines like, "The Christ who sets us free." The phrase spread on placards, painted on walls, even sung in local choirs. And this shift was not confined to churches. Politically, the encounter gave momentum to a broader movement already simmering. Traoré had risen to power by promising sovereignty, dignity, and independence from neo-colonial influence. His words at the Faith Forum connected that political agenda to a spiritual one. It was no longer just about resisting French control over Burkina Faso's gold and cotton. It was about reclaiming the African soul from centuries of religious domination. For many, this convergence felt like destiny. A new theology was being born, not in seminaries, but in the hearts of the people. Scholars later gave it a name, Liberation Gospel Africa. It was a vision of Christianity where faith was inseparable from justice, where prayer and protest walked hand in hand, and where the Bible was read not as a tool of submission, but as a manifesto for freedom. In homes across the Sahel, elders recalled the prayers of grandmothers who had endured famine, colonization, and war. They now saw in Traoré's words an affirmation that their humble faith had always been enough. In the streets, young people who once dismissed Christianity as a colonial relic began to reconsider. If Christ was truly the liberator, not the oppressor, then perhaps faith could once again belong to them. The political establishment, however, reacted with caution. Some leaders welcomed Traoré's blending of faith and justice, calling it a revival of African dignity. Others feared it would destabilize delicate balances between Christians and Muslims or invite retaliation from Western powers. Yet even critics could not deny the impact. Churches were fuller, civic groups more active, and ordinary people more confident in speaking truth to power. International observers noted that this shift might alter the landscape of West Africa for generations. Where once sermons echoed the accents of foreign missionaries, now they thundered with African proverbs and calls for sovereignty. Where once religion was seen as an imported garment, it was becoming a weapon of liberation. But with such transformation came questions. Could this new gospel remain faithful to Christ without becoming merely political rhetoric? Would justice and faith walk together, or would one devour the other? Critics in Western seminaries warned of a dangerous distortion, while African believers insisted it was nothing less than reclaiming Christ for themselves. The uncertainty only added fuel to the fire. Commentators across Africa asked whether this was the beginning of a continent-wide reformation. Diaspora communities spoke of a second Great Awakening, rooted not in Europe or America, but in Africa's own soil. For the first time in centuries, Africans were not simply receiving theology, they were shaping it. And in that shaping lay both promise and peril. For if faith could inspire dignity and justice, it could also threaten entrenched powers, foreign and domestic alike. The very forces Traoré had stood against in politics now faced a spiritual challenge as well. Audience question: Moi bin Luan. Do you believe Africa's faith must be tied to justice? Share your thoughts in the comments, because history is being written and your voice matters. As the videos of Johannesburg spread, reactions rippled far beyond Africa. In the United States, where Stephen Furtick's name carried immense weight, the confrontation triggered intense debate. American evangelicals split almost instantly. Some praised Furtick for holding the line, insisting he had defended the heart of the gospel, that salvation is in grace alone, not in political works. They saw Traoré's words as passionate but dangerous, a mixing of church and state that risked distorting Christianity into a social movement. Justice is important, one pastor declared on a Christian radio station, but justice cannot save. Only Christ can. Yet others, even within Furtick's own circles, admitted they were shaken. African-American pastors in particular resonated with Traoré's thunder. They recognized in his challenge the same cry heard in the civil rights era. Faith without justice is hypocrisy. Some called it a modern echo of Martin Luther King Jr.'s sermons, a reminder that the gospel must speak to the suffering of real people, not only their souls. Across the Atlantic, European media treated the moment with caution. Commentators in France noted the irony of a young African leader confronting the legacy of colonial Christianity before a global audience. Some praised his courage, while others accused him of politicizing religion to justify resistance against Western influence. Headlines in Paris read, "Faith or Politics? The young president blurs the line." In the global South, however, Traoré's words struck a different chord. From Latin America to the Philippines, where communities also bore scars of colonial religion, his message resonated as if it were their own story. The Christ who breaks chains was not an African figure only, it was a universal hope. International politics, too, began to stir. Russia and China, eager to frame themselves as allies of Africa against Western dominance, quietly amplified Traoré's speech through their media channels. Commentators sympathetic to Moscow described it as proof that Africa was breaking the monopoly of Western narratives, even in religion. At the United Nations, African delegates referenced the exchange in side discussions, noting how deeply it symbolized a broader shift. Africa was no longer content to be lectured. Whether in politics, economics, or theology, the continent was demanding to speak with its own voice. In theological circles, one phrase in particular became a rallying cry: Christ against colonial Christianity. Academic journals debated it, churches quoted it, and young activists painted it across banners at protests. For some, it was a dangerous slogan that risked division. For others, it was the clearest way to name the truth, that the Christ of empire and the Christ of the oppressed were not the same. The debate in Johannesburg may have ended with handshakes and applause, but its ripples carried into the future like waves against a restless shore. For Africa, the path forward is neither simple nor free of peril. Yet in the echo of Ibrahim Traoré's words lies a roadmap, one that forces the continent to decide what kind of faith, what kind of freedom it will embrace. There are broadly two paths. The first is to continue in the shadow of colonial Christianity, where sermons are imported, traditions erased, and faith remains tied to powers outside the continent. This path offers stability, the comfort of the familiar, and the approval of wealthy Western churches. But it also risks keeping Africa bound, its people repeating the words of others while silencing their own voice. The second path is more uncertain, yet more alive. It is the path of a faith reborn in Africa's own soil, a faith where Christ is not a foreign master but a liberator who walks beside the farmer, the widow, the laborer. A faith where prayer is inseparable from justice, where worship is proven not in words alone, but in dignity restored, children fed, and chains broken. This is the vision of a continent writing its own gospel story, rooted in its culture, yet faithful to Christ. Such a vision demands courage. It will not please every power. Western governments may see it as rebellion. Some church leaders may brand it heresy. But for millions of Africans, it feels like truth. Truth that their ancestors whispered under trees, truth that was denied in colonial schools, truth that now demands to be spoken aloud. For older generations, especially those who kept faith alive in times of famine and oppression, this moment is bittersweet. They prayed for a day when Africa would no longer be ashamed of its voice. Now, they watch as their grandchildren take up that mantle, not in violence but in conviction. For them, the struggle is not just political, it is sacred. The choice before Africa is clear but not easy. Will it settle for a Christianity that blesses empire, or will it rise with a Christ who breaks chains? Will it walk quietly in borrowed shoes, or will it stride boldly in its own? And for the wider world, the challenge is equally pressing. Will America, Europe, and others listen to this African awakening or attempt to smother it? Will they allow the church in Africa to flourish in its own image or insist that it remain in their shadow?